As I said, we're about to start our next panel on the Midwestern Experience with our chair, John Miller.
Thanks very much, Joe. We will just proceed quickly here. In the interests of time, we have our four speakers in order as they are sitting up there. First of all, Paula Nelson, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Paula grew up in Minnesota. She got graduate degrees in South Dakota and the University of Iowa. She has taught in Wisconsin, and she studies, among other things, South Dakota. Paula has two great books on West River, South Dakota that many of you are familiar with in the early 20th century, focusing on Kadoka and other towns out there. And she has been currently working for several years on a study of Canton, South Dakota, south of Sioux Falls, about 20 miles from 1868 to 1905. And she will draw on that study for her talk this morning on civic life in a Midwestern community. Pamela Riney-Kehrberg is Professor of History and Chair of the Department at Iowa State University. She has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. She has several books and articles on childhood, especially in the rural Midwest, a number of other writings on environmental history and agricultural history, and is currently working on editing a volume, The Routledge History of Rural America, and she will be talking about growing up Midwestern. David McMahon is Professor of History at Kirkwood Community College in Iowa City. His research on sports has appeared in various publications and exhibits. David says he doesn't mind writing for the old lady in Dubuque, unlike the New Yorker. And his topic is the role of sports in the Midwest. Joe Anderson is Associate Professor of History at Mount Royal University in Calgary. He teaches, among other things, agricultural and rural history, environmental history, public history, and the history of the Midwest. He has edited The Rural Midwest since World War II, published by Northern Illinois University Press in 2014, and I think I saw a couple of volumes there. I think they're selling them at the table back there.
I let one go.
He let one go? Oh, he let one go if somebody wants it. Talk to me, I carry around my book on small town boys too. Excuse me for saying that. He's also written a book, The Industrializing the Corn Belt, 1945 to 1972, and another book or two, and many articles. He is working currently on a number of things, including Pigs in America, 4 Centuries of Contested Occupation. And he will talk this morning on Midwestern identity since World War II. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Put this over here to avoid wiping out the equipment, which is always my fear. What I'm going to talk about today, at least, well, probably all of it, I guess, the kind of things we take for granted, that we don't think about in much detail, that sometimes we look at it and don't even realize that there's a system or a pattern or a culture or a tradition operating and in place. I want to talk about how a society, in this case Canton, South Dakota, as John mentioned, operated, how it managed its daily life, how people contributed to its civic life, which I guess I do make a distinction between the day-to-day and civic contributions in the more traditional sense as we understand it, and how they manage disorder. So I'll talk about that. And then I'm also going to talk about how the advent of organized, large-scale corporate development in the Gilded Age, because this all takes place roughly in the Gilded Age, how that altered the way people began to deal with issues like order, child welfare, and so forth. And that we would refer to perhaps as the development of institutions. I'll see a little bit about that. And then I'm going to make a leap into a non-Canton topic and talk a little bit about the development of service clubs as a civic idea. Things like Rotary, Kiwanis, and Lions, which came about because of the changes that first corporate change and then the progressive response brought about. So that's my agenda. If I watch the time and have to make a sudden leap to conserve time, I will warn you ahead of time. So, but I'm hoping that I've cut it enough and organized it enough that we can go through it and it'll make pretty organized sense. I do want to say that one of my kind of interpretive tools as I've worked on this particular topic about voluntary association and civic commitment and so forth is an old book, but I'm an older person now, Don Harrison Doyle, Social Order of a Frontier Community, Jacksonville, Illinois. And in that, Jim Davis is mentioned. He's thanked in the beginning, so he was very helpful to that book. It was published in 1978, and to me, it remains one of the solid foundation books, and it explains how you get the kind of dynamic reformist tradition operating across much of the Midwest, especially the northern Midwest. Jacksonville, of course, is different than Canton. It had many more groups pouring into it, much more going on because of its location. But the impact of Yankees certainly always has to play a role when you think about how did these reformist things come about. I taught Civil War for many years. We used to talk there about the Yankee Belt, 39th parallel and above, and you saw that in some of the maps that people did yesterday in their presentations about Yankee, where they lived, influence, that kind of thing. Okay, Canton, like other towns and rural neighborhoods, had both an informal social world based on custom, tradition, and need, and a more formal social order arranged around organized groups and institutions. Both helped sustain the values that dominated the culture. Now, I should tell you, Canton began 1867 with just a handful of people. In the first election for county officers, 16 men voted. By 1880, 1 year after the railroad, it had 635 people. By 1900, it had 1,943 people. So you could see the trajectory was up. Today, it's the largest it ever was at about 3,500, but that's because it's become a bedroom community for Sioux Falls. The early people that I'm familiar with from the newspapers that I've read from 1875 to 1905 would be crushed and disheartened were they to see what had happened, because of course they saw Sioux Falls as competition. And they would be very depressed by what's happened to the downtown with the way economic change has pushed different kinds of agencies, businesses, and so forth to the fringes and left the downtowns, even in small towns, to rot away. But anyhow, in the Canton world, the social world existed because, in part at least, people lived in very close contact with others. Manners were very important. Proper patterns of behavior helped keep the peace. Anyone who's lived in a small town knows that this was a world of observation. It remains that today. Residents of towns walked to their destinations. They saw neighbors and strangers walking by, met them on the street of the business district. When the editor of the paper, Newman C. Nash, walked to work every day, he would comment that he kept seeing poor Sam Thorson asleep drunk in his packing box in the middle of Main Street. And really something needed to be done. You know, those kinds of things are very visible to the world around people. Windows and doors stood open in the summer, voices carried. People had to haul or pump water, so they were outside. Not everybody had their own well. They went to kind of regional wells within the town if they didn't have their own well, so they were always visible. Householders chopped wood for their cook stoves. Women in good weather often washed the clothes on the porches of the home. So there's just constant interactions that we've sort of shut away from to some extent in some of our larger communities. Children played in the yards or in the dirt side streets. And by the way, grass did grow in the streets of small towns. If you remember William Jennings Bryan saying that grasses would grow in the cities in his Cross of Gold speech. They did grow in the streets of small towns, and warnings would always come out, don't picket your animals so close to the sidewalk, keep them in the middle of the street so that people can walk on the sidewalk without problems. Many people boarded in other homes or hotels. it's a different world. People who worked for an employer might board in his home and live in his home. For those of you who are academics, think of going to work every day at your university and then going home to board with your dean. That's the kind of circumstance that people lived in. So it's a world of different kinds of conventions. Families of merchants often lived behind or above the store. Single men were more likely to live alone, but they would have a bed behind the store in the back room or in the livery stable. They slept in the livery stable, so forth. So they were always in the area. Obviously, daily life was quite public. Close proximity could bring trouble, especially when livestock and chickens invaded the neighbors' gardens. That seemed to be the primary thing. People putting out potential death notices for that little calf that the neighbor had if it didn't stop getting in the garden, that kind of thing. And in one case in the 1890s, the captain that ran they had an excursion boat on the Big Sioux River, and the captain that owned that and piloted that went to jail for socking one of his neighbors, and the editor bailed him out. But he socked them because he had the misfortune of living between the only two people in town that still kept hogs. They had kept hogs, everybody kept hogs before. He kept it, and it had been hot and humid and so forth, and the smell had been so bad he just couldn't stand it, and they all got into a fight about it. Close proximity also led to heroism, and this was something, I mean, it wasn't required. You weren't told as a child, the law says or the rule says this, but you did it by observation you saw. If a neighbor's house was on fire, you ran to help. Any other emergencies, you ran to help. If someone became seriously ill, you took them into your house. There was no emergency room, things like that, or in the nearest store. In one case, the man of the family was out chopping wood. His wife was completely bedridden. They don't specify why. It might have been post-childbirth when they couldn't leave their beds for 2 weeks. But the house started on fire when he was gone. And two men going home to their farm came, took her out of the house, bed and all, brought her to the neighbors. The other neighbors alerted, then came, got all the kids out, got what they could out, and the family lost most things, but of course kept their lives, and then the group raised money to help them again. So close proximity also meant that odd noises caught attention, and this was a world where you didn't have a lot of active law enforcement around all the time, but if a man was abusing his wife, the neighbors came over and intervened. That sometimes might mean the waving of guns and hatchets and other things, but it was stopped, and then the sheriff would be called. Animal abuse, if anyone heard animal abuse, there would be intervention in that, and the editor of the paper published the names of animal abusers in the paper. So you have kind of a social watch going on. There were times in Canton when the sheriff lived out in the country at a distance and couldn't be located, or a time when just after they were incorporated in 1881 and they just had a marshal with no deputies or helpers, the public was expected to help, and they did help. And they got criticism if they didn't help. But if there was disorder from alcohol consumption or fighting, which sometimes happened near the bars, then what happened is people would step up, drag them out of town, get them in the wagon, drag them out of town, fight with them if necessary, and then call the sheriff, who would then come in from his farm place and try to manage the whole thing. So it isn't a culture where you can say it's not my business. Everything in a way is your business. And if you look online ever at things like why people don't like the Midwest, there are actually discussion groups that have been held about why is the Midwest so boring, or why don't people like the Midwest. And my favorite is Midwest sucks. There's a discussion on that too. They tend to identify these kinds of observational and interventional behaviors that they would hate. They would think they'd have to go to church, they'd think everybody would be in their business, and so forth. People who answer on those groups, who are in the Midwest or have been from the Midwest, they tend to respond that that's what they like about that world. So you have a rather deep clash when it comes to those kinds of values. Now, my second topic is going to be kind of the traditional civic interventions, or civic contributions, I should say, the kinds of things that organized groups did, certainly in enlightened self-interest, but also to help the community. Some of the most obvious, they did things like the people of Canton wanted to stop the competition from Beloit, Iowa, for trying to build the best place to build a railroad to, and so they pooled their money, built the courthouse, and donated it for free to the county. Certainly out of their pocket and very helpful. Another thing they did, obviously, several times, organized to get a railroad, and it took them 12 years. Another thing they did, Forest Hill Cemetery Association. Things we don't think about. But in Canton, they were burying people in just a piece of pasture ground just northwest of town that somebody had said they could use. Well, as time went on, they couldn't keep track of the graves were falling in. It was a terrible mess, and so quite literally. And so what they did is we have to have a cemetery association. They got it organized, but the individuals had to be responsible for moving the graves of their loved ones, friends, and so forth. So they had to do that, and that was constantly in the paper. If you don't get your loved ones moved, whoever is going to pasture the land, the fences are going to go up. And the problem is a lot of these people had moved away. And so they didn't have, the dead didn't have anyone to act for them. And they may still be there today for all I know. But obviously, public donations to build churches. Women's groups were the prime service agents in the community in terms of raising money for a variety of things. This is going to be an interesting problem when the service clubs come around in the 20th century, because men have to become aware of the ways that they can do service that isn't female, that aren't female ways, because females had been in service and so forth. Beginning of modern issues. The development of institutions. In Sioux Falls, they developed what was known as the Children's Home. It was done as a private agency. The people who ran it supported it themselves. They took donations from places like Canton and so forth. And what they tried to do is provide homes, an orphanage-type atmosphere for a home. What happens in Canton is that they have a Norwegian couple, lives out on a farm that has, over a period of years, been a problem and has had difficulty with abuse and fighting and the husband overworking wife and children and those kinds of things. And the community decided in the 1890s that they were going to take action if it happened again. And the woman came in to swear out a complaint against her husband, and the community just sat her down and said, "We will handle a divorce for you if you will agree to divorce him and send him away." And she said, "Yes, great." So the person who was her lawyer was Oliver Gifford, who was the first territorial representative of Dakota Territory to Washington, and first representative in Washington after statehood. He was her lawyer. They got them divorced. But then she had the children and was not able to care for them very well. And so they intervened again 3 years later. And this is where the process of bringing the children's home came in. And the children's home wanted the youngest children. They took them in. They posted before and after pictures in the post office. This is what the Gunderson children looked like when they came to us. This is what they look like now. This is what we can do with your voluntary help. In this case, it was not controversial to have those kids taken from the mother and taken to Sioux Falls. Over time, as the trend becomes stronger, it will become more of an issue. When do you institutionalize children? When do you take away those private rights? But it begins to be a possibility as soon as there's a children's home. Eventually, the state of South Dakota starts helping support the children's home, and it's now a state agency completely, I believe. But it's still in Sioux Falls under a slightly different name. But the town steps in. Now, finally, service clubs. What's going to happen, again, this seems like a strange leap, but keep in mind, we're from institutions to service clubs, we're looking at a thread of reform and change from the old way of the individual entrepreneur and free market merchant to a world where the free market merchant no longer feels that he has an authority or a voice. And what's going to happen is you're going to have service clubs develop. They're going to be a Midwestern institution, at least initially, because their headquarters are all going to be in Chicago. And what you're going to have is a small town boy who goes to Chicago. He's a lawyer, he doesn't know anybody, he doesn't know how to get business. He creates the Rotary by finding other businessmen who will meet with him, and they rotate from office to office for lunch and discussion of business. They made it initially primarily about business. Then the second club follows in just a few years, organized in Detroit. Kiwanis, the man that organized it, thought that that was an Indian word meaning we trade, hence the name. And they started also with business, but then went to service. Finally, Lions, they from the beginning in 1917 recognized that the men wanted service. They wanted to contribute to their communities in a way that they could enhance their business, enhance cooperation, find a new way to have voice and authority, ways that corporate change had taken from them in a way, and through the progressive world of association had come and created this new way. Again, the idea of service had to be redone or redefined and accommodated to a male point of view. But this is what will happen. And Lions Club today is the largest. It was the one that aimed mostly at the smallest towns, 5,000 or less. And it was a way of moving people from this early world of, I can do this, I'll take my money, I'll change it, I'll make it, I'll fix it, I'll lead it, to a world where I don't have all that much authority. We now have changed everything in our communities, but this is what I can do to respond. So it's an interesting transition, and it's an interesting way, I think, to think of as you drive through small town America. The symbols that you see on the highways as you go into the towns are more than just some guys getting together for lunch or dinner, having a fine time. They represent a social change and a way of dealing with social change, taking from one world to another. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really exciting to see everybody here to talk about Midwestern history. I'm going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is the history of childhood. And to tie this into the last session, Annette's question about nostalgia is one that I'm going to be dealing with, at least obliquely, in my talk this morning. Now, after setting myself the task of writing a paper on growing up Midwestern, I realized I had made a horrible mistake. I spent most of the spring trying to think about this and realizing that my thoughts were becoming muddier and muddier as I tried to tease out a paper. The truth is that we know a great deal about individual Midwestern childhoods, but what we know about Midwestern childhood writ large is considerably less clear. What does it mean to grow up Midwestern? If a historian takes her cues from economist John Ise's autobiographical account of growing up in the late 19th century in north central Kansas, it means to work hard on a family's land, experience drought and grasshoppers and near economic ruin, and decide in one's adult years to make a life somewhere other than the farm. That was Ise's growing up Midwestern. Drawing inspiration from John Miller's recent book, Small Town Dreams, growing up Midwestern might mean coming from a small place, but having great ambition and using that ambition to propel oneself to fame and fortune, often well beyond one's Midwestern origins. That was the story of Henry Ford, Meredith Willson, and Lawrence Welk. Equally, a historian could draw inspiration from a later period of history and Beth Bailey's book, Sex in the Heartland, which chronicled the sexual revolution on the campus of Kansas University. To be young and Midwestern in that account was to escape the stifling conformity of the nation's midsection and experiment with all the joys that freedom from parental restraints had to offer. The growing up Midwestern of the late 19th century was not that of the early 20th century, nor was it that of the 1960s. Place, space, and time all changed the contours and the meaning of childhood and youth. As is true in other sorts of history, place, space, and time have a considerable role in the history of childhood. Probably the best example of this and the best regional history of childhood that I've seen is Elliot West's masterful narrative, Growing Up with the Country, Childhood on the Far Western Frontier. West's discussion of Western childhood was bounded on two sides. On the one side was place to the west of the Mississippi or the Missouri River. The other boundary was a more elusive concept, the frontier. The children West described were living in new places recently opened to settlement by Euro-American peoples. These two features of their lives strongly shaped their prospects. As he wrote, quote, "The Western experience meant one thing to older pioneers and quite another to the younger. The youngest emigrants had little of the East to remember, and those born in the new country had none whatsoever. For the young, in a sense, this was not a frontier at all, not, that is, a line between the familiar and the new. Rather, it was the original measure for the rest of their lives, and that measure was not the one their parents had known," unquote. As West so carefully delineated, being raised in a particular place and a particular time mattered. Historical surveys of family history and the history of childhood are not without discussions of place, but interestingly enough, they are largely without the Midwest. Stephen Mintz and Susan Kellogg published Domestic Revolutions in 1988, and it's one of the standard texts in American family history. In it, we find the predictable geographic markers, Puritan New England, colonists in Jamestown. In fact, the early period in that book is fairly well signposted in regional terms, with discussions of the variety of experiences imposed by varying terrain and climates and resources. Slavery, too, of course, is located in the South. Industrialization, somewhat problematically, is placed in the cities of the Northeast. The Midwest, Chicago, evidently not part of it. The rest of the book is largely without the nation's midsection, although Chicago, of course, does merit an occasional comment. Joseph Illick's 2002 book, American Childhoods, takes a different approach. He categorizes childhood experiences based on race, class, and broad categories of residence, such as suburban, inner city, and rural. In places where attention to region would have substantially enhanced the discussion, such as the very short section on rural childhoods, he remains silent. The result is rather unsatisfactory, given the enormous ways in which rural childhood was and is shaped by regional considerations. Even Stephen Mintz, in his tour de force on childhood, titled Huck's Raft, that book spends little time on the meaning of region in children's lives. The enormity of his task lends itself to bucket discussions of the experience of childhood and youth. Region is simply not a significant part of Mintz's story, and the Midwest as a place does not figure strongly. If the standard texts on the history of childhood have little to tell us about Midwestern experiences, there are a plethora of other accounts that do provide us with snapshots of childhood in the heartland. While there is probably no such thing as a representative story or a representative Midwestern childhood, I'm going to use 3 of these stories as an example. Each of these stories I've chosen is from a best-selling book. These stories sometimes tell us something we want to hear about this region we've chosen to study. 2 of these stories tell us about a life that in some way represented an ideal. But sometimes these stories tell us about things we ought to do better, something that needs improving because it so flies in the face of societal perceptions of what a childhood in the nation's heartland should have been. One of the best known of my chosen stories is that of Mildred Armstrong Kalish, and if you haven't read this, you should. She grew up in Iowa and recounted her childhood in a best-selling book, Little Heathens, Hard Times and High Spirits on an Iowa Farm in the Great Depression. Unlike the usual late 1920s and early 1930s script, Kalish's grandfather banished her father from their lives, and her father and mother divorced, something that was somewhat unusual for that era. Although she and her siblings lived in town during the winter in order to attend school, Kalish's story is largely one of a somewhat unusual family facing farm life in hard times. But it's not a sad story. Kalish's narrative includes all the homey and important elements of their lives, such as domestic and wild pets, farm work, and cooperation, topped off by the kind of food your grandmother would have taken to a Midwestern potluck. The reader, in fact, learns how to make, and there are recipes, such Midwestern farm favorites as wilted lettuce salad, scalloped corn, buttermilk pancakes, and homemade marshmallows. There is also a strong note of earthiness about her story, as well there should be, given its location in the heart of Iowa's farm country. It's the tale of lives lived within a framework of hard labor, thrift, and caring. What resulted was a love story about growing up in the rural Midwest. As the book reviewer for the New York Times commented about Kalish's writing, quote, "She reports quite convincingly that she had a flat-out ball growing up. It was quite a romp." And her terrifically soaring love for those childhood memories saturates this book with pure charm, while coaxing the reader into the most unexpected sensations: joy, affection, wonder, and even envy, unquote. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived a Midwestern childhood well within the parameters of what we would expect of that set of experiences, and conveyed her experiences in such a way that most of us, with the tiniest bit of nostalgia, would want to share a piece of it, even if just in the form of a piece of her grandmother's pumpkin pie. Move forward a generation, and the interested reader can take a stroll through Bill Bryson's childhood in the Des Moines of the 1950s and 1960s in his wonderful book, and again, if you have not read this, you must, The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid. Clearly, this was a different place and a different kind of childhood than Mildred Kalish's, but nonetheless one that inspires the same kind of awe and envy. Bryson was the child of two working parents, again, somewhat unusual for that time, but he grew up in the midst of post-war prosperity, and he grew up in Des Moines, which was a place that he described as, quote, safe and wholesome. It was a nice city, a comfortable city. It was also a city with which its young inhabitants were incredibly familiar. The kids in this urban Midwestern world, wrote Bryson, and this is a little long, but I want you to hear this. He wrote, the kids were, quote, always outdoors. I knew kids who were pushed out the door at 8 in the morning and not allowed back until 5 unless they were on fire or actively bleeding. And they were always looking for something to do. If you stood on a corner with a bike, any corner, anywhere, more than 100 children, many of whom you had never seen before, would appear and ask you where you were going, unquote. And I love the mental image that gives me of that childhood in that place. It was a world where children could easily and happily play in the park, on their street corner, or in the buildings of downtown, all places that Bryson frequented regularly and on his own. The only real terrors in this world were poison sumac and the neighborhood bullies. As the book reviewer, again in the New York Times, remarked, almost with a sense of wonder, quote, at the heart of the manifold exaggerations is a much larger truth, a shocking revelation that few memoirists have been so brave to admit. He had a happy childhood, unquote. A joyous engagement with place sits front and center in Bryson's memories of his early years in Des Moines. Now, the last set of Midwestern childhoods I want to discuss is unrecognizable in relation to those of Mildred Armstrong Kalish and Bill Bryson. This set of Midwestern childhoods is that of Pharaoh and Lafayette Rivers, with whom journalist Alex Kotlowicz became acquainted in 1985, just a generation beyond the Des Moines childhood described by Bill Bryson. Again, the boys' experiences became the subject of a best-selling book, this one titled There Are No Children Here, the story of two boys growing up in the other America. As the title might suggest, this is no story of hardworking but happy rural families. This is also no story of heartwarming hijinks played out against the background of a wholesome and comfortable city. Instead, it is the story of the failures of the Midwestern family system in a particular time and place. It's the story of a mother who cared and cared deeply, but had no support from an absent partner. It was the story of a place that was not conducive to the needs of children, and an urban environment that was completely unhealthy in a way that the Des Moines of the 1950s apparently was not. Pharaoh and Lafayette Rivers grew up in Chicago's infamous Henry Horner homes, and there was no golden glow surrounding the Rivers boys' childhood. Nobody comes away from that book wanting to visit their childhoods as readers might with Kalish or Bryson. These boys lived with unrelenting struggle. There was never enough money. There was never enough parental support with an overwhelmed mother and a largely absent father. And the physical environment in which they lived was hardly conducive to a happy childhood. When Pharaoh and Lafayette wanted to experience anything like the outdoors available to other children in the earlier generations, they had to make their way to a railroad track at some distance from the housing project. There, bushes and trees grew wild, and the boys might find butterflies and wildflowers and dig for snakes, but they had to cross gang territory in order to get there. That little patch of dirt was unable to compensate for inadequate economic, social, and educational resources. They were children without what most Midwesterners thought of as a real childhood, and children largely without hope, hence the title, There Are No Children Here. As Kotlowitz wrote in his epilogue, quote, both Lafayette and Pharaoh want to move to a safe and quiet neighborhood. Lafayette talks about it on occasion, so does Pharaoh, who sat on his bed one day and cried because he worried he might never get out of the projects, unquote. Unfortunately, getting out was not to be, and neither of the boys got the happy ending that we want for the Heartland's children. Their story, in myriad ways, is at odds with so much that we would like to believe about the collective history of the region's young. These crazily juxtaposed stories leave the historian in a quandary. If we're going to write the history of Midwestern childhood, how should we do it? I'm back to that sense of panic that I felt contemplating the vastness of the topic growing up Midwestern. How do we go about writing about a regional history of childhood when the individual stories that make up that collective whole are so at odds with each other? We are, I believe, stuck with the challenge of boundaries and the challenge of layers. When the historians of the 1970s and 1980s began the monumental task of creating a social history of the American people, they soon discovered that everyday life in the American past was more complicated and fragmented than anybody might have originally thought. The experience of men was not that of women. That was a bit of a surprise of the 1970s. Ethnicity and race added on additional layers of complication, as did class. Communities in their first stages of development, too, were not the same as they would become once they'd matured and gained a certain degree of stability. A community in decline was different as well. Then historians added on another layer, discovering that the North was not the South and the West was another creature altogether. Rural was not urban, and rural non-farm was not the same as farm. Farm tenants and owners might or might not share a common history. One of the most recent discoveries has been that child life is significantly different than that of adults. We are, it seems, a people of layers, and which one of these layers was more important in any one time and place could be significantly different. So can we write a history of growing up Midwestern? It's probably best from the very beginning to take a cue from Joseph Illick's work and to title it A History of American Childhoods instead of A History of a Midwestern Childhood. It is a story composed of many layers. Some of those layers are going to look remarkably like those embodied in larger histories of American childhood, while others may not. Was Midwestern farm childhood in the immediate post-Civil War period similar to or different from that of their peers in the South? There were certainly some similarities, but the differences had to be significant. Was Midwestern youth culture during World War II more similar to or different from the youth culture of Los Angeles in the same period? I would err in that case on the side of difference, but the truth is we don't really know. We know the history of youth culture in Los Angeles during World War II. We do not know the history of youth culture in Des Moines in that particular era. Would Pharaoh and Lafayette's childhoods have borne a greater resemblance to those of children with the same economic and social background in New York City or to those in Dubuque? Here, other factors may very well trump geography. The history of childhood is still enough of an unknown country that we are a very long way from comfortably being able to answer these and a host of other questions, but being willing to ask the questions is certainly the best place to start. Thank you.
I'm talking about the role of sports in the Midwest, and when I started thinking about the topic, I remembered an anecdote about a fellow who was apparently an expert researcher on sex, and he was asked to give a talk, and he went up to the podium and he said, "It gives me great pleasure," and then he sat down. It's very much the way I feel about sports. We've been talking about sports in the hallways, and I've got a very close friend here, Jason Duncan, that we've obsessed over sports for many years. And so I enjoy watching sports, writing about sports, and it's been an important part of my life ever since my childhood. So the things that you were saying there are very, very relevant to what I want to talk about today. I'm here because John Lauk, in his best Frank Sinatra voice, said, "Be there." So I want to begin by talking a little bit about nostalgia, because we've been talking about it so much this morning, and I just want to put my 2 cents in for now. Some years ago, I wrote an encyclopedia entry in the Encyclopedia of Local History on nostalgia, and so the discussion that we were having in the previous panel and Pamela's work is very relevant. I had surveyed some of the intellectuals on nostalgia, Christopher Lasch and Michael Kamen and D. Jackson Lears, and kind of a prickly historian who's conservative in the European sense, John Lukács. And at the end of it all, I came to a sense about nostalgia that, it's not such a bad thing. There were times as a historian that I was pushed away from things that I wanted to inquire about, and as I began to think about this issue of nostalgia, I think for many years nostalgia was used as a charge to disparage regions and people who were interested in regions. And so I think, when it comes to nostalgia, this sort of longing for the past and so forth can be a good entry point into history, and as long as you continue with being very critical about it. In fact, to some extent, I was thinking today, we're a product of a couple nostalgic or maybe over-romanticizing moments. John Lauk's interest in reviving Midwest history is a very romantic idea, and his daring do has brought us here. We're here at a center where a gentleman has a vision of civic engagement, and so I think nostalgia can be that thing that gets us off the couch and doing the kinds of things we should, as long as we maintain a critical approach to it. And I often see again that I'm a little impatient with the charge of oversimplification or calling these types of things nostalgia, because I think it's done damage to pursuing the kinds of things that we want to pursue. And I think also, as well, anybody who is fool enough to go to a graduate school and get higher training in history should write about whatever the hell they want to write about, and do it well. Carl Becker, a great Iowan, one of the great early American historians, says, "I don't care what you write about, just make sure it's a good book." And I think that's the spirit. I'm going to share with you a few of my obsessions today. Obviously, I don't have time to go and say everything there is to know about the role of sports in the Midwest. There's a packet that I circulated that contains some of my thoughts and some documents as well. I'd like to have a conversation about that. Just to say a couple things generally. Here we are talking about the revival of the Midwest, and I think it's a very propitious moment because we're also at a point where public history, among other things, has matured and is moved from the margins into the center of the practice of history. And sport history, like Midwestern history, like public history, has often been the red-haired stepchild, if you will, of the historical profession, and now it's come into the center of historical study as well it should. Very recently, there was a Journal of American History issue that was a kind of state of the field issue, and it's a sort of long overdue recognition for scholars who work in this field. I began work in this field kind of by accident. I was asked to write a chapter on civil rights in a book on African American history in Iowa, and I said, let me try sports, because I was so interested in sports, but I'd never really written anything about it, but I was always constantly thinking about it. And so I moved into the literature kind of on my own, and there was hardly a mentor around that one could ask about this stuff. And so the situation, I think, is much better now. What I'd like to do today is just talk about a couple things. Let me leave the quotation up for a minute. My obsessions, if you will, in history have related very much to my childhood growing up in a small town of Manila, Iowa. Manila was today it probably has about 850 people. It may have had 1,000 people when I was growing up. It was noted as a hotbed of two things: seed corn companies, seed corn capital of Iowa, had seed corn companies on every block, it seemed like. And it was a hotbed of girls basketball and generally high school athletics. And I thought everybody grew up in towns like this, and as I grew up and went off to graduate school and traveled other places, I realized they had not. The situation that we had in Manila, at least I felt it growing up, was having a deep admiration for the girls of Manila who played in sport. In fact, people didn't care as much about us boys playing. And that's kind of an unusual situation. And my sisters, my cousins, my friends, and all the women I knew had been part of this culture. And as I left that small town, I realized how important, how pathbreaking it was. Manila, it was, just to tell one story, there was a time in which the medium-sized cities and the larger-sized cities really didn't do much in the way of high school athletics, even for girls. It's really a sort of a small-town thing. And there were occasions when there was one occasion when a girl from a medium-sized town moved to my hometown in order to participate in athletics, and she ended up being a record setter and so forth. Ultimately, the high point of growing up in Manila, at least as a little boy, was when Manila won the state high school basketball championship in 1974, which is a big deal. Back then, the broadcast of the Iowa Girls High School Championship was broadcast over several states. People would plan their vacations all throughout the Midwest. They would come to participate in this event. The year that Manila won, there was something over 90,000 people had shown up to watch the game. 14,000, 15,000 people in order to watch the championship game itself. It was quite a thing in Iowa for so many years. And more to the point, too, of what I'm talking about today is it's fine to write about Midwestern history, but it's also important to teach about Midwestern history in the classrooms. That's where I get my biggest audience. And so talking about growing up in this way and rooting it in Iowa so that my students can understand it, I think is very important. Also growing up in Iowa, in addition to girls' athletics, we also laid claim to a famous sports writer, Maury White of the Des Moines Register. And so I've been looking into to his life and his story writing as well. And beyond that, my mother grew up in Van Meter, Iowa, and John Miller, to plug his book again shamelessly, has a great chapter on Bob Feller and his small-town Iowa boy upbringing. And he was a frequent visitor to my grandfather's house when I was a kid, and it was an amazing thing to have a Hall of Famer, sitting there in we would all be waiting for him in the living room and very quiet and so forth. And my grandfather would tell me stories about Bob Feller, and more importantly, he would tell me stories about the Negro League teams that Bob Feller would barnstorm again. And so you think of a small town in Iowa where you have some of the greatest major league ball players in America and the greatest Negro League ball players. It really was a sort of field of dreams experience. And those stories made me dig into the history a little bit and write about the African American experience in Iowa, which is something I continue to do. And then I stumbled on the story of the University of Iowa, which turns out to have had a path-breaking role in terms of the history of black athletes in intercollegiate sports. We're here, in effect, in Big Ten country, and it made a difference, the region that we were in. And so some of the things that I'd like to show you in the time that I have today is just a sampling of some of those stories that I think are very important. You see a quote up here. I think I'll start here because the audio wasn't working the last time I tried. This is Ronald Reagan, who was a sports announcer for WHO radio in Des Moines, and he used to do the Hawkeye games as well as to do the Cubs games as well. And he famously tells a story about a disconnection and him having to make up the story of the game as an announcer. But he writes here, the problems were when you played another team that did not have a black. For some reason or other, then they would pick on this one man. I saw Dick Crane and Ted Oslowski walk over to the Illinois huddle during a timeout. They walked over and they said, do that to him once more, and we're going to run you right out of the end of your stadium. Iowa had a long history of African-American participation in football in particular. The earliest black athlete was in the 1890s, Frank Holbrook, who was living in Tipton, Iowa, which happened to be a little stop on the Underground Railroad, and there was some gentleman in the town that helped pay his tuition to make him part of it. And that tradition extended all the way into the teens, the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And there are a number of notable African-American athletes like Duke Slater, who ended up in being a judge in Chicago. And Duke Slater was playing at Iowa at a time when very few African-Americans were playing in what we call Division I football these days. And so the Chicago Defender would pick up stories of Iowa football and broadcast them wherever the Chicago Defender was read. And this is probably why Ozzie Simmons in the 1930s made his way with not a dime in his pocket to Iowa City, because he knew that if you're a black athlete, you would have an opportunity to play there. And Ozzie Simmons became a phenomenon on the football field, but he's most noted for an incident that happened in the Iowa-Minnesota games where, like so many black players, he would be singled out for rather rough play. This incident was the start of a tradition called the Floyd of Rosedale Trophy, which began when the governor of Iowa said, when the game was in Iowa City, I hope the Iowa fans won't put up for the rough play that happened last time. And so it got to be a very heated thing, and the governor of Minnesota then tried to defuse the situation by betting a prize pig from the state fair. Unfortunately, Iowa lost the game. And so the Iowa State Fair champion was then presented to the Minnesota governor, Floyd of Rosedale. And now that trophy is exchanged every year for the Iowa-Minnesota football game. And few people know the racial underpinnings of that story. Let's see, I'm going to try a little audio here. One of the biggest names in Iowa, the biggest name in Iowa, athletic history here, is Niall Kinnick. I just want to give you a clip here. Does it work? So a couple incidents that I focus on is I talk about, for example, this incident that involves Ozzie Simmons, because again, it's very historic. Ronald Reagan happened to be the broadcaster, and this was a time when there was just a handful of African-American athletes in major college sports. Being here, I'm reminded of the fact that Gerald Ford played football in Michigan, of course. He was a Michigan man, and he very famously was quite angry when Fielding Yost left Willis Ward off the field, and it was something that stuck with him for the rest of his life, and he remained very fervent about that, and that really affected his character. As for the University of Iowa, as I was explaining, there was a long history, and Duke Slater was one of the monumental figures. There's also a guy by the name of Archie Alexander who was in, about 1910 or so, and he was once, Ebony Magazine once called part of the largest, most influential interracial firm in America at the time. He was an engineer, and he and one of his football mates put together an engineering firm, and he ultimately was the guy that did the work for the down in Tuskegee that led to the flight training program there. And so there's a long history, but the person I wanted to talk about here, if I can get to Google him, is Niall Kinnock. Niall Kinnock is the... Okay. Okay, sorry. The packet that I handed out, just in case the technology didn't work for me, has a few documents in it. There's a handful of things that I want to just point out to you. One is a promotional book after my hometown won the state championship in 1974. And again, there's a couple guys in Iowa City that are documentarians that I've been talking to. They've produced two really interesting documentaries that have to do with sport in the Midwest. One of them is called The Forgotten Miracle, which is about the 1960 U.S. hockey team that won gold. Everybody always thinks about the 1980 hockey team, but there was a previous hockey team. And the other documentary that they made is called Pond Hockey, which is about a particular tradition in the upper Midwest of playing hockey. And there's sort of a lament now that hockey players are guys that learn how to play on the ice in the mall rather than out on the ice on the lake. And so I've been talking with them to make a story, because I think in Iowa we have something better than Hoosiers. You know, we have the sort of men's version of Hoosiers in that wonderful movie, but we haven't quite, I think, tapped Iowa girls basketball to the extent that we can. And in the story that I was telling, you know, we were a very small town that won over a bigger team, and it was it was a historic moment, sort of the zenith of what one author had called really the most important girls' athletic activity in American history. And so I think there's more to this story. The other clip that I wanted to show you was there's a documentary on Johnny Bright. The Johnny Bright incident in 1951 was when the leading ground gainer for Drake University was drubbed his jaw was broken in a game against Oklahoma A&M. And this points out not just the racial violence that happened within the region, but particularly when a team from the Midwest would leave the region and go to the South. He was Drake's greatest athlete ever. He was the first black, I presume, to have made his way into Oklahoma A&M Stadium, now Oklahoma State. And there was a lot of publicity prior to him getting there, and this incident was racially motivated. The difference is the Des Moines Register caught it. The photographers caught it on camera, and it became newsreels that were shown all over the United States, and it was a major moment in understanding the racial injustice in sport. And Iowans reacted quite angrily. There's a great article that came out recently in Annals of Iowa. We have the editor of Annals of Iowa, Marvin Bergman, here on this issue. There's a couple other things in the packet I thought you might find interesting. There's a Heisman Trophy ballot, or information about the Heisman Trophy balloting. And it has maps of the sections, and you can see how the sections changed. It's one way of looking at the a spatial view of the Midwest. And finally here, there's some information on Bill Bryson, as Pamela was talking about before. Bill Bryson's father was a sports writer in the Des Moines Register, and the Des Moines Register used to be one of the great papers in the United States. There was a time when it had more Pulitzer Prize attached to it than the New York Times, and those days are over, unfortunately. It had a sports section, the Big Peach, that was quite something. And as I mentioned, there's a fellow that grew up in my hometown, Maury White, that became a sports writer, and I got to know him very late in my life, and he had an incredible career. And I got to thinking that here's a person who had a column on a daily basis that went out to more than 500,000 people. Here's a Midwestern writer of some importance, and in his files, it shows the level of interest in his writing, and it's something that I want to explore. So, thank you for listening, and I hope we have time to talk more. Sorry about the visuals.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. Morning. Almost afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I want to add my voice to those who have thanked everyone at the Hauenstein Center, especially Gleaves and Ann, as well as the sponsors for this event, not to mention John and his role in rounding everything up. I'm grateful to be on the program. I want to thank you all in advance for your interest and patience for the next 15 minutes, I promise. But first, a quick apology. I'm going to start by talking about myself, fully aware that none of you came here to hear me talk about myself. But having lived in the Midwest from 1973 to 2006, I've earned the position of participant observer. So I'm going to borrow this concept from our anthropology colleagues to inform my talk. In 2006, I accepted a teaching position in a small city about an hour from Atlanta. And over the next 2 years, I received a real education in what it is to be a Midwesterner. So as a new Southerner, I was stunned by the advanced state of decay of houses in middle-class neighborhoods. Decaying soffits, algae on the siding, cracked shingles were common. Equally surprising was the extreme length of the grass in lawns of middling neighborhoods. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution even ran a story about lawn care, posing an age-old question: how tall should grass be before it is cut? When I brought the article to the office to discuss it with a colleague, an 8th-generation Georgian, that's 8 generations in Georgia, his reaction was, "My God, the conformity." My response was, "Yes, please." In one sense, our differing reactions were hard to explain. We were born the same year, grew up in 2-parent middle-class households without fear of missing a meal or losing shelter. We were both confirmed in Protestant denominations, joined the Boy Scouts, vote center left, are heterosexual married males with kids and PhDs in American history, and remain mostly nerdy. Yet there was a regional chasm that helped explain our varying standards of maintaining the lawn, an important middle-class cultural artifact. The disconnect was all the more striking, given that during my previous years in Iowa, my wife and I lived across the street from dear friends who were our opposites on every political issue. It was a Hauenstein Center moment because we were great friends. We agreed on how high the grass should be when it was cut. And there was peace. Without making too much of lawn care or generalizing based on limited experience, the fact remains that my Midwestern self was challenged by my Southern brother from another mother. What was going on? What is going on? Today, I want to explore the ways in which Midwesterners have presented themselves to the world when the lights are on. 2 cautions are in order. First, we can all agree that even Midwesterners do not agree on where the region is, let alone what cultural identity might or might not be shared between us. My second disclaimer is that my discussion is limited to a mostly white middle-class identity. I've been working on other lines, but 15 minutes is not going to get me there. So, onward. Let's set the Wayback Machine for the 1940s. Kansan Kenneth S. Davis explored his Midwestern identity in 1949 when he addressed readers of the New York Times in a feature story titled "East is East and Midwest is Midwest." Despite the increasing standardization of American life, Davis contended, regional differences persisted in 1949. Among the Midwestern traits Davis highlighted was middle-class conformity, echoing Sinclair Lewis's critique. Midwesterners even conformed to a knee-jerk praise of rugged individualism. The irony did not escape Davis. He stated that, quote, "It is precisely because the Midwest holds the individual person in such esteem and lays such stress on individual rights and obligations that pressures develop which tend to crush individualism of mind and spirit into a dead level of conformity," close quote. In addition to the coexistence of conformity, rugged idealism ideal, Davis also singled out his fellow Midwesterners for a high degree of gregariousness when compared to, quote, Easterners. He noted a relentless Midwestern boosterism and booster speak, think Babbitt. Yet Davis also asserted that Midwesterners shared a sense of the wider world, a cosmopolitanism that made Easterners look provincial by comparison. He illustrated this by recounting that during World War II, soldiers stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas, who called Manhattan Island home, were surprised to learn that residents of Manhattan, Kansas, had indoor plumbing. Davis balanced criticism and praise in his depiction of Midwesterners as friendly, engaged, if overly conforming strivers. Over the next 20 years, Davis moved on to more profitable subjects, most famously a multi-volume biography of FDR, one that won some prizes too. But if Davis was right, and gregariousness, conformity, and a booster ethos were dominant Midwestern traits, how and where would we see those traits on display? One of the venues for displaying all these characteristics is the state fair. Nothing says conformity like meeting breeding standards for livestock, the best floriculture, or competing for the best set of human twins, triplets, or multiples. I'm not making that up, in case you're wondering. Of course, other regions have large state fairs, rivaling those in the Midwest. Oklahoma, New York, and Washington, even surpassing Midwestern attendance in the case of Texas. Furthermore, some Midwestern fairs have not been successful. Michigan ceased state funding in 2009. The fair continues, but as a private corporation. But Midwestern fairs are consistently popular across the region, attracting large crowds of insiders and outsiders. The phenomenon of the agricultural fair in post-war urban and suburban America continues to sustain a rural identity that is especially important in the Midwest. Agriculture is important in every region, but it is critical to the identity of Midwesterners. We all know that California agriculture is the most profitable among all the states, but we also know that in California, agriculture is concentrated in the Central Valley and in the wine-producing regions. Large swaths of the state are mountainous, desert, or forest. By contrast, with the exception of northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, the Midwest is what I would call relentlessly agricultural. What about the Southeast, which has been heavily agricultural in the post-war period? The difference here is one of relative prosperity. In the old Cotton Belt, tenancy and wage labor conspired to shape an identity that juxtaposed poverty and oppression with wealth and power. The dominant Midwestern farm story has been somewhat different. Here, the image, and I stress image, of the farmer, owner, operator has attained mythic status. Those who bought tickets to the first Farm Aid benefit concert in 1985 did so to benefit family farmers. In other words, worthy, independent producers who used their physical, mental, and emotional strength to feed the nation while enduring natural and man-made hazards. The agrarian ideals embodied in Farm Aid and those of the red barn, white farmhouse, and picket fence variety that typified Midwestern farms. It's not surprising that 8 Midwestern states have hosted the full Farm Aid concert experience, with Illinois hosting 4 times since '85. Midwestern agrarianism has been reinforced many times in many ways since World War II. At the end of the war, one booster proclaimed that the Midwest, quote, produced more benefits for humanity today than any other region on earth, close quote. According to this author, these benefits were tied to the region's agricultural and industrial production, not cultural, artistic, or spiritual activities. Midwesterners embodied a producer-oriented agrarian ideology that made these claims resonate. They've conformed to an agrarian image, so much so that urban residents frequently claimed that farming was superior to city life. The conformity to agrarian ideology is a true hallmark of Midwestern identity, on the farm and off. Earlier in this talk, back in 1949, Kansan Kenneth Davis offered us a look at Midwestern regionalism in the immediate post-war period. We can only wonder how he would have assessed the changes in the Midwest and the nation 20 or 30 years on. Fortunately, we have the well-documented views of another native son, Garrison Keillor. Regardless of whether you're a Keillor-phile or a Keillor-phobe, it is difficult to deny the important role he's played in explaining the Midwest to Americans. even Midwesterners, through his fictional, now mythical Lake Wobegon. Almost a decade ago, Sam Anderson of Slate wrote that since the first broadcast of A Prairie Home Companion in 1974, Keeler, quote, turned himself into a kind of every Midwesterner, quote. And of course, it's worth noting, a white middle-class Midwesterner. Most importantly for my purpose today, Keeler confronted regional conformity. The heart of Keeler's Midwestern sensibility is this, and I shouldn't have to tell you. Don't think too much of yourself, because you're no better than anyone else. Work hard and do your best. Don't draw attention to yourself. Implicit in this notion of egalitarian conformity is the cosmopolitan worldview that Davis exposed in the 1940s. For all of our attention to the conversation at the Chatterbox Cafe or Pastor Inkvist's sermon, listeners and readers are made aware of how these things are simultaneously critical to us and banal. Midwesterners have been self-effacing enough to be aware of the wider world, to know that beyond St. Paul and Chicago, there are no dragons. There's an important corollary to Keeler's version of Midwestern conformity. Keeler shows us that it is acceptable to laugh or at least smile at it. Part of his message is that we're in on the joke. Again, Slate's Sam Anderson saw this gentle mocking as Keeler's way of honoring his home and his people. Keeler's comforting tales of Midwestern conformity have served as a salve for Midwesterners at home and abroad. Blogger Abe Sauer recalled how A Prairie Home Companion was a touchstone of Midwestern normalcy as he lived and traveled around the world. While fellow expats were excited to receive recordings of popular American television shows like Friends, Sauer confessed that his secret glee was bootleg copies of A Prairie Home Companion sent to him by his brother. Keeler's voice, Sauer observed, quote, reminded me, and still does, that home was still an actual place to which I could go back, even if the years had faded the memories too much to any longer proffer proper nostalgia. Yet despite all this, Keeler, the iconic Midwesterner, does not formally embrace regionalism. In John Lauch's 2013 interview with a man, Keeler was downright cagey, hesitant to recognize the region as a valuable lens of analysis. He conceded that claiming the Midwest was a useful disguise, his words, not mine. Whether he accepts the term or not, it is what he does. Keeler's identity is the white middle-class Midwest. Yet, Keeler sees it as a Midwest that is fading. Contrast the Keeler of 1985 with the Keeler of the 21st century. In 1985, he described how residents of Lake Wobegon would rather purchase hideous eyeglasses locally than designer specs from the boutique in the city. This made sense to people because, as Keeler stated, Calvin Klein isn't going to come with a rescue squad, and he isn't going to teach your children about redemption by grace. You couldn't find Calvin Klein to save your life. So local mattered to these people. 20 plus years later, he noted, quote, the question, where are you from, doesn't lead to anything odd or interesting. They live somewhere near a Gap store, and what else do you need to know? So even for Keeler then, the standardization that Kenneth Davis feared in 1949 had come to pass, erasing traces of Midwestern cultural identity. All of which brings us back to where we started. Is the creation of this identity a response to the fact that what was once the most American of regions is losing what made it most American? This is historian David Danbaum's view of the rural Midwest, that whatever traits made Midwesterners and their region distinct existed before World War II and probably began to fade sometime around World War I. The conformity that Davis saw still exists, but in Danbaum and Keeler's view, it is conformity to mass culture, and that is what is killing, or perhaps has already killed, Midwestern identity. I disagree. Of course, the standardization of culture, including the ever-present tyranny of chain restaurants, media and cable companies, and celebrity culture, has eroded regionalism. But I suggest that those Midwesterners who doubt whether or not their cultural identity is real simply need to leave the region to find it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. That's great. And everybody loved it. So we have 10 minutes, maybe an extra minute or two if we have to. Yes.
Thanks, David. I really, the talk was good. I really especially appreciate what you said about women's basketball. Because I always experience kind of I remember my mother taught in a one-room schoolhouse in Iowa and coached the women's basketball team. But do you think there's a big difference since Iowa dropped its six-person teams?
Yeah, it was.
Which was unique in the country, and that was women's basketball, was women's six-person.
Right, I didn't go into that very much, but I think the way that I approach it with my students is to talk about kind of the unintended consequences of reform. What happened was, essentially, in a nutshell, the story with Iowa girls basketball was there were reformers in the 1920s, progressive of a kind, who thought in that day that it wasn't a great thing for young girls to be in interscholastic sports. And so in areas like the cities, when basketball had begun in Iowa, sort of died out, but there were, ironically, a group of men who were these small school principals and superintendents and so forth, who knew how important the game was to the small communities. And so they created this unique Iowa Girls High School Athletic organization. And that's what kept it alive. And so when this wonderful thing comes up that's kind of an anachronism, it blooms, and at the end of the period, we've now gotten to a point where, after Title IX, for example, opportunities for young women are more and more available, and you've got this anachronism of a 6-on-6 game. And so now the cities who are just now getting the games are adapting to the 5-on-5 game, and their notion is that their girls aren't going to be prepared for collegiate athletics. But the interesting part was when, about the time that Title IX came through, 20% of all high school athletes in the nation were from one state, from the state of Iowa. Perhaps it's the only state that ever had a slightly larger percentage of girls participating in high school athletics than men. And even at the time when the reform came through, there were a number of Iowa girls who had made the change from 6-on-6 to 5-on-5. In fact, one of the young women from Manila was an early first college athlete to get 4-year scholarship at the University of New Mexico. She was an early player and a precursor to the WNBA. So there's this extraordinary story of this thing that appeared. It was so much part of the culture. And now it's faded away. And the other thing is that the nation has stepped forward, and in a sense, Iowa girls' participation in athletics has dropped down a bit. So it's an interesting story. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, question.
I have a question for Paula. You talked about how the service clubs came in, and they had to masculinize the idea of service in order to feel comfortable doing those activities. How did the women who had traditionally dominated service work in those communities respond to that change?
They kept doing the kinds of things that they've always done, because male service tended to be, the Lions have the pancake breakfast, and that raises money for various things. The Rotary people tended to build parks, that kind of thing. So what you have to contrast it with, I think, is that men had been accustomed to saying, I'm master of my fate, and I'm going to build this business block with my name on it, and I'm do this kind of civic work. And then they had to change that to a much smaller kind of, we're going to have the pancake breakfast, and we're going to put the water fountain in the park, and we're going to do those kinds of things. Women still had the whole host of things, especially related to the church, but also related to the school, with the growth of the PTA, things like that. Missionary societies. I think there was still such a host of things that women did. Men really just kind of added a layer. They weren't really doing the exact same things. They didn't aid the churches, for example. So they had to come to terms with the idea that you could have smaller scale service and that still mattered. And women didn't have to change really all that much in terms of what they were doing.
Yes.
Just for David, I was thinking about WHO and Jim Powell, and the kind of things that went on that show was kind of a migrant
That's where you want to write for the lady in Dubuque.
It was Helen Harrington.
Okay.
The lady from Omaha. And she would come on and start talking, against the war. And like, for the next hour after Helen got off, there would be just like a massive pause. And, like, it's just so memorable for me, that time.
I want to add something to that I forgot to say. I was talking about now Kinnick, and he won the Heisman Trophy in 1939, and he very famously said that he said, "Finally, if you will permit me, I'd like to make one comment, which in my mind is indicative, perhaps, of the greater significance of football and sports emphasis in general, and that is, I thank God I was warring on the gridirons of the Midwest and not on the battlefields of Europe. I can speak confidently and positively that the players of this country would much rather struggle and fight to win the Heisman Award than the Croix de Guerre." And this is something that's shown now at Kinnick Stadium before the game. And it's very interesting because oftentimes, say it's Iowa and Iowa State, and then you've got jets flying overhead, and it seems very patriotic. And there's sort of a missing of the context of the time, right? If you listen to that statement, he's saying, I'd rather be playing, and this is 1939, the Nazis have already invaded Poland, and there's kind of a deep, I think, Midwestern sense of kind of isolationism or wariness about what's coming, and it's sort of missed in this patriotic gore that it sometimes is thrown into. And when he says Croix de Guerre, there had previously been a Hawkeye that had been killed in World War I, and I think he's thinking of that. One of the first people to die in World War I was an Iowan, and one of the first to die in World War II was an Iowan, in addition to the Sullivan brothers. So this is this is something that needs a little unpacking, and 70,000 people see it, and I wonder what they're thinking. So thanks for the comment.
Question back here.
Yes, I have an observation, then a question on Midwest.
I'd give it a little crack there. It is certainly true Southern Ontario walks, talks, acts a little bit like the Midwest, certainly the upper Midwest. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, I tell Canadians who have no clue where Nebraska is, right? When you're in 5th grade, you have to memorize all the states and state capitals. Well, the Canadians get 13 provinces and territories, and looking at 50 states and capitals is just ridiculous. So they have no idea where Nebraska is or no idea where Iowa is. My department chair always makes fun of me. She says, when people ask you where you're from, you always say the Midwest. I say, yeah, because nobody knows where Iowa is. Just a quick anecdote. I was teaching American Civil War. I'd had students read an article by Leslie Schwalm on Upper Midwest and the diaspora of African Americans during the Civil War. A student had commented in class, he said, well, I think what was happening in Idaho was, I said, wait a minute. I said, I think you mean Iowa. He says, Idaho, Iowa, whatever. So it's tough for them, and I get it. But you're absolutely right. I think especially Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Southern Ontario certainly share a lot in common.
Could I just add one thing to the Canada thing? There are a lot of Hawkeye football players that ended up playing for the Canadian Football League, particularly Calvin Jones, who was an African-American who didn't play in the NFL because the NFL was quite racist at that time. And so there's this movement across that border and a very significant impact that Iowans and others in the Midwest had on Canadian football and vice versa.
Jim, your point's well taken. Yeah.
Well, it is 11:45 here. One more, John?
One more. Quick question. One of the things that kind of hangs over the whole conference, and it came up in this session, is the issue of nostalgia. And Professor McMahon brought this up, and Lynette brought this up earlier, and Pamela mentioned this. And it seems to me, I think we're thinking, or the comments have been made about nostalgia, that, and we're thinking about it in conventional terms, like, oh, we fear nostalgia, let's not go down that road. It seems to me the bigger barrier to us as an association and to getting the
I've been thinking about that over the last couple hours here, and I mean, nostalgia certainly, in a sense, is a loaded term. It's a very negative term in many ways, and it's a term that the real historians used against local historians a lot, and I've always been more of a local historian, so I've always sort of resented it in a sense. But the way I think about it, I guess, is a little bit different. There's a quote, and I cannot remember who said it. It's not me, but it's somebody. I'm homesick for a place I've never been. And I feel that way about the eras that I study. Like, I'm, in a sense, homesick for 1880s and 1890s, eastern South Dakota and Canton, because I want to know them and understand them and see them. But that doesn't mean that I am, in some sense, going to actually pack up my bags and move there. I want to understand them in their context and that kind of thing. And I guess there is an element of nostalgia to it, because I do see things that are really, really good about the things that they did. Really, really good. And that should and can be emulated in our society, and in some ways would be a lot better off. And so I don't see the sense of wanting to go back, wanting to understand, or enjoying, or thinking about, or like you said with Bryson, just telling your tale as you saw it, as a negative kind of thing. And yeah, we do have to, we've always add that caveat, you have to maintain a critical distance and those kinds of things. And certainly there are things I don't like about it. But I think if we are historians, we are kind of all homesick for what we're studying, wanting, in a sense, to understand it the way we understand our home place. So,
There was a poet, Brendan Keneally, once said that the essence of being Irish is to never let a friend go into oblivion. And so you tell stories, loving stories about their personality and so forth. And so I think I sort of bristle at the nostalgia thing, because I think it's been used by a pejorative by Richard Hofstadter, by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., to stop inquiry in areas that, frankly, I care to dig into. So there.
Let's give the panel a hand.